So I wanted to go ahead and give you just a little bit more clarification and information about the PowerPoint that's up this week. I know I have a lot of slides on it. Mostly that's because there's just lots of photographs that are good examples. I wanted to hit up some highlights though, and I wanted to definitely make sure I touch on all of the elements for each specific category just to give you some further ideas. So some of these slides I'm going to say, okay, you can go ahead and read through them. Basically, again, what we're striving for in this class is to take pictures that have intention, that are intentional. They're not just as like, sometimes, yes, you get lucky and you have this offset moment that you just happen to snap and it works out perfectly. But most of the time, we want to have some idea of planning, and something to keep in mind is composition. That's going to help us arrange our photograph. And one way that we think about composition, or the way something is arranged on the picture plane, is by using certain elements of photography. And if you've had other classes with me, you'll definitely see some overlap between the elements of photography and the elements of art, or the elements of design. They're all fundamentally very similar. There's a couple words in this that I exchange, I think it's value and form for. So again, if you haven't had my class, it's not something you have to worry about. If you have had a class of mine in the past, just know that going in. So basically, again, if I'm taking a photograph, it's a snapshot. It's a quick, documentation of a memory. It's not something that I've done a lot of thought or planning into. I might say, hey, you guys, it's our birthday. Let's take a picture together, or let's take a selfie. It's a quick, spontaneous, spur of the moment thing. If I'm making a photograph, on the other hand, though, I'm taking time to plan. I want it to come across like, again, I'm doing this with intention. So I want to pay attention to all the little details. That's one of the things that hopefully as you go throughout this class, you're going to start to notice what makes a great photograph. Well, I have control and I've planned things. You'll see this word that comes up quite a bit. I'll highlight it. It's called focal point. So that's where my eye is going first. When I talk about the focal point, I'm talking about where is my eye reacting to first. Here, I can see that the very first thing my eye goes to is this kid on this bicycle. So the focal point here is off center. It's not smack dab in the middle. That's something that we'll talk about throughout a couple of these modules as we move forward. So photography, it's not just about the center of the photograph or the subject. I also want to think about what's supporting that main focal point or that main subject. So I could have things going on in the background. Maybe they're supporting it, or maybe they're fighting it. Maybe it's too distracting and I need to refocus and I need to bring it back together. So the reason we start with the elements is because I want you to, number one, start off, getting used to your camera. Number two, I want you to start thinking about how can I bring elements together to make them work instead of fighting each other. So that's something to keep in mind, is that yes, I talk about these elements as one thing after another thing after another thing, and I put them in their own categories. When you are taking photographs, especially when we get, midterm on, these aren't things that just appear once or twice. Typically, you're going to see all of these somehow in some capacity in a successful photograph. So keep that in mind. So when we talk about the elements of photography or the elements of composition, I'm going to have line, color, shape, contrast, emphasis, texture, and space. So what this means, my elements, they're things that I can visually see. I can see line, I can see color. So that's one thing that we talk about in many classes, is the differences between the elements of design and the principles of design. In this case, I'm saying composition / photography. Elements are things that I can see. Principles are things that I take and I arrange, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on. I don't want to introduce too much at once, but just know that my elements, they're things I'm visually seeing. So that's why we start off with them. So very first one, and some of these are going to be really obvious, hopefully. Line. I start off with taking pictures of line. And so in this case, I can work with intention. You can see that I have line leading me up to that opening, the oculus at the top of the dome here. it is directing me towards that opening. I'm using these strong lines to move my eye to the center point. I can also use it to create patterns and shapes. This is the top of the ceiling of the kind of the lobby space of the British Museum. And you can see all of these lines individually. Sure, it's just a line. It's a straight path. But when it starts to intersect one another and then you start to look at these arcs, I create these repeated triangular patterns. And one of the reasons, of course, there's more than one element going on in this photograph, but the bulk, the majority, the focal point of where my eye is going is line here. And that's why I'm choosing to use this piece for line. And again, and this is a great example, we will do a shutter speed project, but this is a great use of shutter speed here. I can create movement, so you can see my eye is moving around and around and around in paths because I'm using that sense of line to repeat itself in a circular fashion. Color. So color here, you can see it is bold, it is aggressive, it is in your face. I can use it to create interest. I can pull people in. You can see here, this is zoomed in so far that really I start to see shape. I start to see the little circles, but for the most part, I see that bright swath of red, and then I see a little bit of a blue and a little bit of a green, at least for me on my monitor. So I'm bringing people in because you see that bright color. You say, I want to know what that is. Let me see more detail here. You can also create emphasis using color. So depending on who you are and how you're looking at these images, your eye is going to go to certain things first. I always look at this photograph and it takes me kind of a second to dissect it because there's so much going on. For me, this red, and again, red is a powerful color. This red image off to the right really stands out for me. Number one, it's shorter than everything else, but number two, it's a really powerful color. So that's where my eye starts to kind of separate that right, what would be a magazine holder from the left three elements going on. Again, I'm telling the viewer, hey, look at these colorful objects. And it might vary a little bit. The focal point for you might be slightly different. But when I talk about emphasis, I'm talking about, again, I'm emphasizing something. I want to make a statement about it. We also talk about shape. So shape, again, you've probably heard of it before, right? You know, we think about our lines and our circle, or our squares and our circles and our triangles, so on and so forth. I can repeat a shape to create a pattern. So you might have heard that again in line. You can see these stained glass windows. There are these giant shapes that arc up towards the top. And I can see, number one, the actual form of the window repeats itself. So there's a shape. And then you break down, you zoom into these window spaces, and you can see here's a shape, here's a shape, here's a shape. So they repeat themselves. Again, lots of elements. You could also use this for color, but I'm looking at where the bulk of my emphasis is on my photograph. For the most part, I looked at this as an example of shape because, again, I have so many different examples here. Let me zoom back in a little bit. I can also repeat shapes. Again, not surprising, to create variety and emphasize the focal point. So within these little bubbles here, these little circles, you can see that each shape is different, but they're placed so close together that my eye, it flows from piece to piece to piece to piece. And I actually almost read this as a line. I don't know about you because of how close together everything is. Things to keep in mind. So example, I can have a distinguishing shape, which means it's isolated. And because it's isolated, it is emphasized. So I have two giant shapes here that really kind of fight each other for focal point, in my opinion. I have the giant sphere on the left that's happening, that circular form, and it is so dark in value. That, for me, is where my eye goes first. I look at that half circle that I can see. I also have that person, right, that's walking along the surface there, and they're the lone wolf, right? They're by themselves, they're individual, and because of that, that's where my eye is going. So you can think about that. I don't have to have shapes that are close to one another. I can purposely isolate them to make them seem, again, much more intentional. And of course I can overlap shapes. So you can see here the lily pads where, again, things are physically overlapping one another. So contrast. A lot of the times we think about contrast, we think about black and white. Or if you've taken other classes before, maybe a complementary color. You think of areas that are really dark next to areas that are really light, and those dark values make the light values pop, and vice versa. So here, again, you look down into the pool, you can see these people, because they are so much lighter than the rest of that murky water, they're sticking out because, again, they are light in value and the water is dark in value. On the other hand, you can also think about contrast as different textures that are standing out from each other. So hard and soft is a classic example of that. I have the, my saplings, my that's not the right word, but my growth here, my grass seedlings, they're this really nice soft texture. If I run my hand over it, it'll be really soft. In the foreground though, I have these hard rocks. So that is one classic combination when I think about contrast in terms of texture. You can also think about lighting. So in addition to value, aka black and white is what I'm thinking of. In addition to texture, you can think, okay, areas that are really dark are going to make really light areas pop. So where that hand and that doorway is, it's really brightly lit. The rest of it isn't. So that is going to make that doorway stand out. Color is another thing. So if you think about my complementary colors, like colors that are across from each other on the color wheel, reds and greens are going to make each other pop. Yellows and purples, blues and oranges. So think about that color scheme because I can use color to make other colors pop. Here, that green doorway is popping against the red brick and it is making that doorway stand out. I can't look away from it. It is in my face. Size is another one. So here we have this little kid. He's pointing at this giant dinosaur skeleton and he seems so tiny compared to the dinosaur. And that is another great use of contrast. Putting something really big next to something that's really tiny. Emphasis. Here's another one. I am using emphasis. So I'm literally emphasizing where I want my eyes to go in order to bring attention to the focal point. So here you can see, number one, light is being used. Line is also being used. You can, then start to talk about value, but my eyes are being guided by these lines, the shadows that are pointing towards this light here. So everything is based on that light that's not quite at the center. And you can see there's a pentagon that's actually being formed on top here as well. I can also think about where I'm positioning something. So here, this is a classic reflection picture. Instead of taking a picture, by lining it up on the horizon, here I'm looking at the reflection. It gives me a different viewpoint and it makes something a little bit more interesting. I can also think about depth of field or focus. And what I mean by that is right here, you can see that the background is fairly blurred and my subject, my plant in the foreground is pretty, in focus. And that's what I mean by having depth of field. That means that my subject is in focus and the background is blurred. So here, because I can't see much in the background, I'm really looking at that plant. Framing the subject matter. So you can say, okay, number one, I can think about the photograph as the physical frame itself. So how you arrange your camera and your lens and you look through that viewfinder, you're actually creating a frame there in itself. So that's number one, thinking about how, when I go through that, rectangular or square space, is my subject going to be arranged? Number two, I can think about framing through, like architecture is a great example. Here, if I look at that bicycle, which in this case, it's one of the subjects in this photograph, it's being framed by being positioned under this archway. So you can use frames that maybe aren't traditionally thought of as a frame, like an archway or a doorway, and that will add further interest to your photography. Texture is a great one. I love texture. This is probably what you're going to remember from this course is Heather really likes texture. But again, that contrast between hard and soft, when I can physically feel a soft object and a hard object, it just creates such a great interest visually. So here, again, I have this brick kind of wall that's in decay. Clearly it has, some struggles going on. And then I have this overgrown foliage. And number one, not only because of the texture, I'm not saying you take a picture of something hard and soft and immediately it's a great photograph. In addition to that, that person taking this has thought about the contrast between placing this really 2/3 of the way into the picture and about so it's not quite halfway down. So they're dividing their page in a smart way. Again, value, I think about how light or dark something is because this has those like recessed squares going in and it's a metallic surface. The highlights or the light is catching the very top of the surface and you can see where the shadows are forming. And it gives me information about a subject. So something here, I can see that this is a sharp textured item. Probably not going to be something I want to touch. It's probably going to cause me harm. Without that detail, I might not be able to tell that this is a cactus. It's pretty zoomed in. I can't see the whole thing. So we needed that sharp texture of the cactus to give us a clue as to what the subject was. And then I think about space. And for this class, we're thinking about a physical space most of the time. So here you can see this is literally the interior of a room. And I can see that there's a person taking a photograph through a window. So it's kind of like a multi-space picture, right? Like we have the actual space of the room. And then we have the person looking out the space. And here we are again, another example of space. This actually is a space. So again, it's a physical place. You can actually see this one came off of Flickr. This is not my picture. But they use the railing here within the space to point towards this person who is really harshly lit by the sun. And you can see the shadow. And again, it's in black and white. So contrast automatically goes up. And this is all pointing to this person walking out the door. It's just a great use of line, of value, of, space. Again, you start to talk about shape because of the shape of the person, the shape of the railing. So you can see how, yes, I want to take pictures of each of the elements, but you are going to naturally have some overlap. It's not going to normally be just like one thing or the other. So at this point, the last couple slides are your assignment and some reminders. And I'm not going to read this to you mostly because number one, should have seen this in the introduction already. And number two, I have this written on Canvas for you as an assignment. So I wanted to make sure, again, I don't have a specific book that goes along with the elements. This is something that I teach, again, every semester. So I wanted to give you some clues as to what they are. If you have further questions, please let me know.